This is the Commander's Beacon. I'm Eric. Alright, so by the time you're watching this video, all of the spoilers for both Strixhaven and Commander 2021 have been released. Now, rather than do a review of the entire set, because there's a lot of other people that already do very good and very comprehensive reviews, instead I want to select a subset of the themes or the commanders from Strixhaven and from Commander 2021 and talk about some of the unconventional ways that you might build around them. So I'm really hoping to get a deck built around Cody Vociferous Codex, as I've mentioned earlier, but this is also a really tough deck to build, so maybe that will happen, I'm not sure yet. I'm working on a deck with Zimone Quandrix Prodigy, but I also want to focus on some of the stuff from Commander 2021 as well. I'm working on an idea for a deck built around Octavia Living Thesis. This is a mono blue 10 mana 8/8 that has Ward 8, that's basically hexproof. It costs 8 less to cast if you have 8 or more instant and or sorcery spells in your graveyard, and it has a Magecraft ability to give target creature base power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. So Octavia is really flavorful as sort of an octopus commander, but I'm asking the additional question, can Octavia be effective? So maybe we'll find out. I feel like there's also something creative you could do with Fane the Broker. This is a mono black 3-mana commander that's sort of like a trading post. It has 3 tap abilities and you can pay 3 and a black to untap it. Now you can tap Fane and sacrifice a creature to put 2+1/+1 counters on target creature, or you can tap him and remove a counter from a creature you control to make a treasure token, or you can tap him and sacrifice an artifact to make a 2/1 Inkling token. So Fane can do a lot, but I'm not yet sure how to best capitalize on his abilities without just making another Black Aristocrats deck. But anyways, these are some of the ideas that I have in the works that I'll be putting out videos for soon. But today we're talking about a Boros commander from the Strixhaven main set. It's Quintorius Field Historian. So Quintorius is a 2/4 legendary elephant cleric that costs 3 red-white. Quintorius gives all spirits you control +1/+0. He also has, whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. So Quintorius is sort of like Tormod the Desecrator. They both make a creature token when one or more cards leave your graveyard. And it doesn't matter where those cards go from your graveyard. If you shuffle cards from your graveyard into your library, you make a token. If you exile a card from your graveyard, you make a token. If you return stuff from your graveyard to your hand or to play, you make a token. Or if your opponents do any of these things to you, you can make a token. So it's actually pretty flexible. But notice that both Tormod and Quintorius trigger when one or more cards leave your graveyard. So if you, say, exile your graveyard all at once with a Relic of Progenitus, you only make 1 token. These effects don't care about how many cards leave your graveyard, they care about how many times a trigger goes on the stack to make something leave the graveyard. So to capitalize on Quintorius, we need to have small numbers of cards leaving the graveyard all the time. So can we use Tormod for inspiration when building around Quintorius? Both have abilities that care about things leaving the graveyard, and both create creature tokens as a payoff. For Tormod, that creature token is a 2/2 that enters tapped. For Quintorius, it's a 3/2, or effectively a 4/2 since Quintorius buffs all your spirits power by 1, and it doesn't enter tapped. So Quintorius is kind of a better Tormod, except of course that Quintorius is in Boros colors, while Tormod is in black. Where all the graveyard recursion lives. And that's the biggest difficulty I think in building around Quintorius. When I look at strategies for building commander decks, like when I look at different commanders on EDH Rec, I think the thought process often goes, well, what does my commander do? And then let me find a bunch of other cards that also do that thing and put them in my deck. But when it comes to Quintorius, there are no other cards in Boros that do what he does. Quintorius makes tokens, and there's a lot of cards that do that. But the way in which Quintorius makes those tokens is very unique, again, especially in Boros colors. So what can we do with Quintorius? Well, the most direct option might be Spirit Tribal. So Quintorius buffs your spirits, and there's a fair number of cards that make spirit tokens. These are often little 1/1 flyers, and Quintorius will turn them into 2/1s. That's not bad. And spirits are actually a pretty decent tribe. They got a lot of support in Boros colors and Strixhaven, And I think that Spirit Tribal would make a passable Quintorius deck, but it wouldn't capitalize on Quintorius' ability to make spirits. Sure, there's a few spirit-related cards that either make spirits or care about spirits and remove things from your graveyard. Dauntless Cathar, for example, is a 3-mana 3/2 that you can pay 1 and a white and exile from your graveyard to make a 1/1 spirit token at sorcery speed. So when you do this, you actually get another spirit token from Quintorius, since a card is leaving your graveyard. And there's a couple more creatures like this. There's also Thalia's Geistcaller, a 3-mana creature that makes a 1/1 spirit token whenever you cast a spell from your graveyard. And if you're playing with spells that have maybe flashback, then when you cast the spell from your graveyard for its flashback cost, that card is exiled, and Quintorius makes a spirit token too. There's the new Returned Past Caller, which returns a spirit, instant, or sorcery spell from your graveyard to your hand when it enters the battlefield. So again, Quintorius makes a spirit token. But Returned Past Caller is also a 6-mana 4/2, and you're never going to be excited about that. But like I said, there aren't a ton of cards that care about spirits and help you get stuff out of your graveyard. So a spirit deck built around Quintorius will mostly be using the commander as a 5-mana +1/+0 tribal anthem, and you might just incidentally make a few tokens with Quintorius throughout the game. And that's definitely not exciting either. So the other thing I thought about with Quintorius was Phoenix Tribal. The Phoenixes are almost exclusively red, and most of them can return themselves from the graveyard to your hand or to the battlefield, and in either case you'll make a spirit token with Quintorius when this happens. So the idea here is that we play around with Phoenixes, and Quintorius just provides us some extra value in the form of spirit tokens for playing with really resilient self-recursive creatures. So as I studied Phoenix Tribal further, it didn't take me long to figure out that it just wasn't going to work. We have access to 26 Phoenixes in Boros colors, and the problem is that even the very best ones are really bad, like 5-mana 2/2s. I narrowed down the list to 11 Phoenixes that, number 1, could actually recur themselves from the graveyard in a way that triggered Quintorius to make a spirit, and number 2, weren't just absolutely terrible cards. But even though they weren't terrible, they also certainly weren't good. I did actually end up including a couple of the most synergistic Phoenixes in my final build for Quintorius, but I don't think the Phoenix Tribe is good enough yet to have its own dedicated deck, so I didn't go with Phoenix Tribal. So I had initially wanted to circumvent one of Quintorius' weaknesses. Quintorius is a 5-mana 2/4. That's not great, and he does nothing when he enters the battlefield. Most of the time you'll need to untap with him before you can start making spirit tokens, and we want to build around his ability to make spirit tokens because his Anthem effect isn't all that compelling. But again, the strategies that we need to use to make cards leave our graveyard to make those tokens, they don't synergize for the most part with anything in Boros colors other than Quintorius. Let's say, for example, I'm playing with Soul Shepherd. Now, this is a 2-mana creature that lets you pay white and exile a creature card from your graveyard to gain 1 life. This is great for Quintorius, by the way. For just 1 mana, I can exile a creature from my graveyard to make a spirit. But there's pretty much nothing else in Boros colors that will reward me for exiling my graveyard 1 card at a time with Soul Shepherd. For Soul Shepherd to be of much use to me at all, Quintorius needs to be on the field. And again, if I don't have Quintorius, Soul Shepherd is absolute garbage. And because Quintorius' effect is so unique, there's lots of cards like this. Some of the cards that make spirits the most efficiently with Quintorius are also absolutely underwhelming without him, like Scrabbling Claws or Phyrexian Furnace. So if we want to capitalize on Quintorius' ability to make tokens, we really need to keep him on the battlefield, or risk a lot of the cards in our deck just doing nothing. So this deck built around Quintorius is really dependent on the commander, but I've also included some ways to keep him on the battlefield. And rather than going all in on removing cards from our graveyard as efficiently as possible, we're instead using cards that remove things from our graveyard while also providing us some additional value, outside of just making a spirit token with our commander, such as spells with flashback. And we're going to cram as many cards into the deck as possible that shuffle cards in and out of our graveyard to make tokens. But we also want these cards to fill our ramp, our removal, our card draw, and our utility slots. We want as many of our interactions as possible to provide us with value while also making a creature token with Quintorius. And the other thing, as unique as Quintorius is, let's face it, he's not that good. Again, he's a 5 mana 2/4 that does nothing when he enters the battlefield, and he's in Boros colors. Even the best Quintorius deck is not going to be super competitive. So I've decided to build a budget Quintorius deck because I don't really see the need to spend tons of money on a deck with a fairly limited maximum potential. So I want this to be a fun deck that you can put together easily and cheaply and try it out, and it'll be different than most other decks. Okay, so that was a really long introduction. With that out of the way, let's talk about what's actually in this deck. So normally this is where I would talk about, I don't know, maybe the cards in this deck that fill your graveyard so you can take them back out of your graveyard to make spirits. Or perhaps the cards that take other cards out of your graveyard, or the cards that buff your spirit tokens or something. But so many of the cards in this deck fill multiple roles, so it's hard to assign a lot of these cards into a single strategy. So for this deck tech, I'm going to start by talking about individual cards. I'll start by talking about a few of the creatures that can recur themselves or other things from the graveyard. Because as we mentioned, I don't just want to fill my graveyard then exile it randomly one card at a time. This might produce the most spirits, but I want additional value when cards leave my graveyard. And I don't necessarily want to exile them either, because then I can't get them back and do it again. Now, Escape is a great mechanic for getting cards to leave the graveyard. Phoenix of Ash is a 3-mana Phoenix, it's a 2/2 with Flying and Haste, and it has Escape. You can pay 2 red and exile 3 other cards from your graveyard to cast Phoenix of Ash from your graveyard. Now this is amazing here, because when I exile those 3 cards from the graveyard to pay the escape cost, I get a spirit from Quintorius. Just 1, not 3, since it's just 1 trigger exiling those 3 cards. But then, since I'm casting Phoenix of Ash from the graveyard by escaping it, Phoenix of Ash is also leaving the graveyard, so I get another spirit token. This applies to any card with escape. Anytime you escape a card from your graveyard, Quintorius will give you 2 spirit tokens. But you can't escape too many times or your graveyard will be empty. So let's talk about another Phoenix. Flamewake Phoenix is a 2/2 with Flying and Haste, it has to attack each turn if able, and it has Ferocious. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you have a creature with power 4 or greater, you can pay red to return Flamewake Phoenix from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this makes a spirit, again because Flamewake Phoenix is leaving the battlefield. But realize your spirits have 3 power, and Quintorius gives them +1 power. So if you just have at least 1 spirit and Quintorius on the battlefield, you can recur Flamewake Phoenix from your graveyard every turn to make a spirit for just 1 red mana. Now, since Flamewake Phoenix's ability to recur from the graveyard triggers at the beginning of combat, and Flamewake Phoenix must attack each turn if able, you'll pretty much never get to use it defensively to block attacks. But still, it's a recurable, pay a red for a spirit, which is a pretty good deal. Of course, we'll play Squee the Immortal. This isn't the cheapest way to make spirits, but you can cast Squee from your graveyard or from exile, and no strings attached. It does cost 3 mana. Now, an even more expensive recurable creature is Eternal Dragon. This is a 5/5 spirit dragon, so Quintorius makes it a 6/5, but that doesn't really matter. It does have plane cycling for 2, so you can pay 2 and discard it to find a plains in your library and put it into your hand, but you can also pay 3 white to return Eternal Dragon from your graveyard to your hand. You can only activate this ability during your upkeep. So first, Eternal Dragon can help you hit your land drops in the early game, and later you can pay 5 mana to bring it back to your hand and make a spirit. 5 mana is a lot, you probably won't do this too often, but it's an okay mana sink if you've got nothing better to do. For more standard graveyard recursion, we'll use Sun Titan and Emiria Shepherd. These cards are pretty much already white staples, especially Sun Titan, but every time these creatures recur a thing, they'll also make a spirit. Now let's talk about Encore. This is a fairly new mechanic that only shows up on a handful of cards in Commander Legends. A creature with Encore can be exiled from your graveyard for its Encore cost at sorcery speed. When you do, you make a token copy of that creature for each opponent, and those tokens get haste and they must attack their respective opponent this turn if able, and then you sacrifice the tokens at the end of the turn. So Impulsive Pilfer is a 1 mana 1/1 goblin that makes a treasure token when it dies. It also has Encore for 3 and a red, which means you'll pay 4 to get 3 more token copies of it, which will die to make 3 more treasures. So when you Encore a creature, you exile it from your graveyard, and that means you get a spirit from Quintorius. But the other reason I've included Impulsive Pilferer is that we really need to get our commander online as fast as possible. Like we said, this deck is really reliant on Quintorius, so we really can't do our thing until he's on the battlefield. So I'm using this temporary ramp, like Impulsive Pilferer, to make sure I can cast Quintorius maybe on turn 3, or at least definitely on turn 4. But Impulsive Pilferer isn't our only impulsive ramp that we'll use to rush Quintorius onto the field. I'm also using Skirk Prospector and Generator Servant. A Skirk Prospector can sacrifice itself, or any other goblin, for red mana, and Generator Servant can tap and sacrifice itself for 2 colorless mana. And again, these are only in the deck so that we can cast Quintorius as quickly as possible. Now let's talk about card draw. Now, we're not playing a wheel deck. First, because that would not really be possible for a budget build, and secondly, we want some control over what goes into our graveyard and what stays in our hand. But we do use a lot of draw and discard effects. And we want these draw and discard effects because we need to put cards in our graveyard so that we can make spirits with Quintorius. So we're using discard effects to fill our graveyard. Bag of Holding has been sneakily good in a lot of commander decks, and it's great here too. This is a 1-mana artifact that says whenever you discard a card, exile that card from your graveyard. It doesn't say instead of that discarded card going to your graveyard, exile it. So that discarded card will go to your graveyard first and then to exile, which by definition means it makes a spirit with Quintorius. But it gets even better. Notice that Bag of Holding doesn't say whenever you discard 1 or more cards, exile those cards. It triggers for each card you discard individually, even if you discard a bunch of cards at once. This means if you play some effect that causes you to discard 3 cards, you'll get 3 spirit tokens with Quintorius when Bag of Holding is on the field. So obviously Bag of Holding is really good with wheel effects, but it's even good without them too. Because you can also pay 2 and tap a Bag of Holding to draw a card, then discard a card. And you can pay 4 and tap and sacrifice it to return all of those cards you've discarded and exiled with Bag of Holding to your hand, so you get them all back and you can use them again. Now I also like Burning Inquiry. This is our budget wheel effect, sort of. It's a 1-mana sorcery that says each player draws 3 cards, then discards 3 cards at random. I really like that this can disrupt our opponents by making them discard 3 cards at random, while also filling our own graveyard. Of course, we'll also use Faithless Looting, which lets us draw 2, then discard 2 for 1 mana. And it has Flashback. By the way, anytime we cast a spell with Flashback from our graveyard, we exile that card, so we make a spirit. The other really cool thing about Flashback in this deck is that a lot of the card advantage spells we're using make us draw and discard, so that we get cards in the graveyard. But discarding cards isn't fun. However, if we discard a card with Flashback, we still get to cast it, at least once, from the graveyard, so it's almost like we didn't discard it at all. So that's even better. So you can bet we'll be talking a lot more about Flashback today. Now I've actually been fairly impressed with Merchant of the Veil. This is an adventure creature. The spell side of the card is a 1-mana instant that lets you discard a card to draw a card. And then the creature side of the card is a 3-mana 2/3 that lets you pay 2 and a red and discard a card to draw a card. Again, this is a really easy way to filter through your deck while putting cards in the graveyard that you can turn into spirits later. Now, Merchant of the Veil isn't a powerhouse by any means, but it is pretty decent card selection with some upside in our deck. Now if we want to head into powerhouse territory, we need to talk about the new Conspiracy Theorist. So again, this is a new one from Strixhaven, and this guy has done really well for me in playtesting. Conspiracy Theorist is a 2/2 that costs 1 and a red. When it attacks, you can pay 1 and discard a card. If you do, you draw a card. But it also has whenever you discard 1 or more non-land cards, you may exile one of them from your graveyard. If you do, you may cast it this turn. So let's walk through an example scenario here. I go to combat and I attack with my Conspiracy Theorist. I get that trigger to pay 1 and discard a card, so I do that. Let's say I pay the 1 and I discard Swords to Plowshares. Now I get to draw a card. But Conspiracy Theorist also lets me exile that Swords to Plowshares from my graveyard. Great, so I make a spirit. And then Conspiracy Theorist lets me cast that card, so I can cast that Swords to Plowshares from exile. So basically, I paid a 1-mana tax on my Swords to Plowshares, but I also got to draw a card and make a spirit. This is a good deal. And you get to pick what you discard. This is really obvious, but basically if you're going to cast some spell during your turn anyways, just discard it to Conspiracy Theorist instead. You'll pay an extra 1 mana for it, but you'll also draw a card and make a spirit. The only downside to Conspiracy Theorist is that it's a 2/2 and it has to attack, so it's pretty easy for an opponent to block it and kill it, but I'll still attack into a blocker and let it die, because its triggered ability is just that good, even if I can only get it once and then the Conspiracy Theorist dies in combat. Now lastly, when it comes to card draw, I want to mention Runehorn Hellkite. Now, this is one of the cheapest wheel effects you can get, well in terms of dollars, not mana cost. It's a 6 mana 5/5 dragon, but you'll rarely cast it. You'll probably just discard it, because you can pay 5 into red and exile it from your graveyard to make each player discard their hand and draw 7 cards. Oh, and of course you make a spirit. Now I've also got a number of spells and effects that buff my creatures or protect Quintorius while also helping me shuffle cards in and out of the graveyard. First I want to mention Pyrewild Shaman. This is a 3/1 creature that costs 2 into red, but we're never going to cast it. Because Pyrewild Shaman also has Blood Rush, we can pay 1 into red and discard it from our hand to give target attacking creature +3/+1 until end of turn. And whenever one or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, you can pay 3 into red and return Pyrewild Shaman from your graveyard to your hand, so you can use it again. Oh, and of course you make a spirit. Now next we've got a few auras. Let's start with Brilliant Halo. This is a 2 mana aura that gives the enchanted creature +1/+2, and that's it. That's fairly underwhelming. But it also has, whenever Brilliant Halo is put into a graveyard from play, return it to its owner's hand. So this will typically go to the graveyard when the creature that it's enchanting dies, and that means you'll get a spirit token because Brilliant Halo will then come back to your hand. And you can recast Brilliant Halo to do it again. A spirit loop has the same line of text to keep recurring itself. There's a few more auras like this too. I haven't included all of them in this deck, but you could. There's a couple of other self-recurring auras that we can use though too. We've got Sentinel's Eyes. This is an aura with Escape that gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 in Vigilance. And Griff's Boon gives the enchanted creature +1/+0 in Flying. You can also pay 3 and a white to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield attached to target creature at sorcery speed. 4 mana is kind of a lot, but this is easily the most versatile self-recurring aura in the deck. Sentinel's Eyes requires you to exile other cards from your graveyard to escape it. Brilliant Halo recurs itself for free, at least to your hand, but only if it was put into the graveyard from the battlefield. If you discarded it from your hand though, for example, it'll just stay in your graveyard. You can always, however, get Griff's Boon out of the graveyard, no matter how it got there. Now, if you also have a sacrifice outlet, you can put some of these auras, like Spirit Loop and Brilliant Halo, into your graveyard on demand by sacrificing the creature that one of these auras is attached to. And then, of course, that aura goes back to your hand and you're making a spirit. Martyr's Cause is a 3 mana enchantment that lets us sacrifice a creature to prevent all damage that will be dealt to a creature or player from one source. So that lets us protect ourselves from damage, or of course protect Quintorius. And we can put any creature into our graveyard, like again something enchanted with a Spirit Loop to get a spirit, or Squee or Flamewake Phoenix just to recast them and again get a spirit. We get a lot of value from sacrifice outlets like this, on top of just, nullifying our opponent's Aetherflux Reservoir or something. I'll also use Fanatical Devotion. This is another 3 mana enchantment that lets us sacrifice a creature, this time to regenerate another target creature. Now this is mostly here as another copy of Martyr's Cause, but it also protects Quintorius from removal. But perhaps the most synergistic protection for Quintorius is Gift of Immortality. This is a 3 mana aura that says when the enchanted creature dies, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control, return Gift of Immortality to the battlefield attached to that creature at the beginning of the next end step. Okay, so this is really cool. If I enchant a creature with Gift of Immortality and then that creature dies, then Gift of Immortality returns that creature to the battlefield. Okay, so a card left the graveyard. Well, if it wasn't a token creature, don't put Gift of Immortality on a token. So anyways, I make a spirit. Then at the beginning of the next end step, Gift of Immortality leaves the graveyard to reattach to that creature. So I make another spirit. So every time a non-token creature dies while it's enchanted with Gift of Immortality, the net result is that I get both the creature and Gift of Immortality back, and I get 2 spirit tokens. And if that creature was a Sun Titan, well, even better. Now, keep in mind that if you enchant Quintorius with Gift of Immortality, you'll only get a single spirit token, because when Quintorius dies, Gift of Immortality will still return him to the battlefield, but he won't trigger the ability to make a spirit, since obviously he wasn't on the battlefield when he left your graveyard. But when Gift of Immortality leaves your graveyard at the beginning of the next end step to reattach to Quintorius, you will make a single spirit token then. And we talked about sacrifice outlets, so if you have Martyr's Cause and any non-token creature and a Gift of Immortality, you can make 2 spirit tokens every single turn, or 8 spirit tokens every round of the table in a 4-player game. Now we do have a few other ways to protect Quintorius too. First we'll use Swiftfoot Boots and Mirror Shield to give him hexproof. Now these don't synergize with the rest of our deck, so I won't say any more about them, but protecting Quintorius is essential, and that's the only reason that these are here. Now because we've got these 2 equipment and 4 auras or so in the deck, and again some of those auras like Spirit Loop help us make tokens with Quintorius, and others like Gift of Immortality can protect him, so I've included Axguard Armory in my lands. This land lets me pay 1 red, red, white and sacrifice it to search our library for an aura and or an equipment, and put them into our hand, so we can get both an aura and an equipment. Now for other cards that can protect Quintorius, I've included Leave to Chance. So this card has 2 modes. Leave is an instant that returns any number of target permanents you control to their owner's hand. This can protect Quintorius from targeted removal or a board wipe. But it also has Chance. This is a sorcery with Aftermath that means it can only be cast from your graveyard, and when you do, you exile the card when it resolves. Oh, and of course that means you make a spirit token. So when you resolve Chance, you get to discard any number of cards and draw that many cards. So this protects our commander, it makes a spirit, it draws us cards, and it fills our graveyard all in one. We've got Prismatic Strands. This is a 3-mana instant that prevents all damage that sources of the color of your choice would deal this turn. Now this is sort of situational protection. It might protect Quintorius, maybe from blockers or a direct damage spell. It can also protect you, maybe from a Craterhoof Behemoth Alpha Strike. But of course it also has Flashback, and the Flashback costs no mana, you only need to tap an untapped white creature you control. Now finally we'll use Spirit Bonds. This is a 2-mana enchantment that lets you pay white whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control. If you do, you get to make a 1/1 spirit token with flying. You can also pay 1 and a white and sacrifice a spirit to give target non-spirit creature indestructible until end of turn. So Spirit Bonds makes more spirits. Not a ton of them, we only have 19 creatures in this deck, but it also lets us protect Quintorius, and we can even sacrifice the 3/2 spirit tokens that Quintorius makes to give him indestructible, since again they're also spirits, so we can sacrifice them. But outside of protecting our creatures or buffing them with auras, I'm also using a few cards that can buff our whole team, and this will help us get in for combat damage if we're making a bunch of spirits. First, Intangible Virtue is an obvious include in any token deck that can play it. This is an enchantment that gives all of our creature tokens +1/+1 in Vigilance. So with Quintorius and Intangible Virtue, then all of the spirit tokens that Quintorius creates will be 5/3s with Vigilance. This is not bad. Now I'm also using Rally the Peasants. This is an instant for 2 and a white that gives all creatures you control +2/+0 until end of turn, and it has Flashback for 2 and a red. So again, discard this early and you can use it later, though you'll lose the element of surprise if your opponents get to see that it's in your graveyard. Now I'll use McKindy's Stampede here too. This is one of those MDFC lands from Zendikar Rising. There's a tapped land that produces white on the backside of the card, or you can cast the front side, which is a 5-mana sorcery that gives all of your creatures +2/+2 until end of turn. And this is not a great card, but it fits here and it's in a land slot. But I really want to mention Marshalling Cry. So this is a sorcery that costs 1 white. It gives all creatures you control +1/+1 and Vigilance until end of turn. So as far as finisher anthems go, it's fairly weak, but Marshalling Cry also has Flashback for 3 and a white, and it has Cycling for 2, so this card is very versatile. You can discard it to a Faithless Looting if you need to, and you can still use it later, or you can discard it to itself for its cycling cost if you don't have a Faithless Looting or something like it. No matter what, Marshalling Cry gives you value when it goes to the graveyard and when it leaves the graveyard. Okay, so let's talk about some of our removal. Apostle of Purifying Light is a 2-mana 2/1 that has protection from black. That's nice. It also lets us pay 2 to exile a card from a graveyard. I really like multifunctional cards like this. We can hate on our opponent's graveyards, or exile things from our own graveyard to make spirits. And okay, so we've been avoiding this for a while, but I think it's time to talk about Crook of Condemnation and Relic of Progenitus and Scrabbling Claws. These are all cheap artifacts that can tap to exile a card from a graveyard. So these are great, cheap ways to get cards out of our graveyard and make spirit tokens. So in this deck I'm running Crook of Condemnation. It costs 2 and you can pay 1 and tap it to exile target card from a graveyard. Or you can pay 1 and exile it to exile all cards from all graveyards. Now, Relic of Progenitus and Scrabbling Claws are a little bit different. They can both tap to have target player exile a card from their graveyard. So first, these abilities don't cost mana, while by comparison it costs 1 to activate Crook of Condemnation. But Relic of Progenitus and Scrabbling Claws also don't target a specific card in a graveyard. They let the target player choose to exile any card they want. So I'm using Crook of Condemnation because it's much better targeted graveyard hate against my opponents, even though it costs me 1 mana to make a spirit with it. Now, just like Crook of Condemnation, the Relic of Progenitus also has a one-time graveyard exile effect. You can pay 1 and exile it to exile all cards from all graveyards and draw a card, while Scrabbling Claws also lets you pay 1 and sacrifice it to exile target card from a graveyard and draw a card. Speaking of graveyard hate, let's talk about Funeral Pyre. This has got to be one of the least played cards I've ever seen. Funeral Pyre is played in only 36 decks on EDHREC. That's 0.016% of all eligible decks. This is an instant that costs white, and it exiles target card from a graveyard. Its owner creates a 1/1 white spirit creature token. So this is perfect for Quintorius. Again, this is multifunctional. We can foil someone who's trying to get tricky with their Snapcaster Mage by exiling whatever they're targeting in response, or we can exile a card from our own graveyard to create 2 spirits for just 1 mana. Of course, we'll play Grim Lavamancer. This is a 1 mana 1/1 that can pay red and tap, and exile 2 cards from your graveyard to deal 2 damage to any target. I'm even using Burning Oil. This is a 2 mana instant that does 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, and it has flashback for 3 and a white. Even with its flashback effect, this is a bit underwhelming, but it's an easy card to discard to any of our discard effects, and we really need a high density of things that can leave our graveyard so we can make spirits. Now I want to talk about Punishing Fire. This is a 2 mana instant that deals 2 damage to any target, but it also has whenever an opponent gains life you may pay red. If you do, return Punishing Fire from your graveyard to your hand. Now someone's going to be gaining life in every Commander game, and when they do you get your little kill spell back and you make a spirit. And I really like that this is repeatable. Now as far as board wipes go, I'll use Cataclysmic Gearhulk, Tragic Arrogance, and Divine Reckoning. All of these wipe out all but 1 creature under each player's control. Some of them kill more than just creatures, but some of them only kill creatures. But anyways, this is great. I mean, if we have a bunch of tokens, we're not probably going to be casting one of these board wipes. But we really need to keep Quintorius on the field, so we want Quintorius to survive our own board wipes, and he can stick around on the battlefield through any of these. And what's better, Divine Reckoning has flashback, so it serves some double duty here. Now finally I've included Warstorm Surge. This is a 6 mana enchantment that has whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So anytime you make a spirit, you'll do 4 damage to something, because your spirits will have 4 power due to Quintorius' buff. A Warstorm Surge is one of our finishers and one of the few ways that we have of winning outside of the combat step. So that's our synergistic removal. And before I move on to the deck stats and the cost, I want to talk about a few of our lands. So again, we aren't focused too much on self-mill and exiling our graveyard to make spirits. Of course, we'll do this, but we want to get some other benefit from it too. But I have included some lands that will help fill our graveyard. Naya Panorama, Terramorphic Expanse, Myriad Landscape, Evolving Wilds, all of these can be sacrificed to go get some basic lands into play. And then we can exile these fetch lands from our graveyard later, if we need to. I've also got Buried Ruin and Sequestered Stash. Both of these can be sacrificed to return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand, and of course make a spirit at the same time. This is not an artifact deck, but we do have 14 of them in this deck, and we will be filling our graveyard at least a little bit, so we'll usually find a target for these lands. But those are the primary constituents of our Quintorius Field Historian deck. So let's talk about the deck stats and cost. This Quintorius Field Historian deck has an average CMC of 2.90. Now normally I'd talk about how much card draw we have, how many synergy pieces, how much removal, and so on. But again, so many of the cards in this deck serve multiple purposes. Burning Oil is removal, but it also makes a spirit. Merchant of the Veil is card selection, and it also fills our graveyard. Marshalling Cry can buff our team, draw a card, and make spirits. So in short, there aren't really clear singular roles for a lot of these cards. So instead of trying to messily assign categories, I want to talk about the deck budget and some of the ways that you might upgrade this deck. There's a lot of cards that fit really well in a Quintorius deck that I've omitted, either because they wouldn't make the budget, or because I just needed to limit the deck to 100 cards. By the way, the deck cost at the time of this recording is $72.90. And again, I've decided to go with a budget build for Quintorius because even though I like this guy, he's very unique. Let's be honest, again, he's not that strong. He's a 5-mana 2/4 that does nothing when he enters the battlefield. That other Boros legend in Strixhaven, Hofri Ghostforge, overshadows Quintorius by far. But if you do want to power up your Quintorius deck, there's a lot of additional cards that you might consider. First, we need to talk about Underworld Breach. This is a 2-mana enchantment, and it says each non-land card in your graveyard has escape. The escape cost is equal to the card's mana cost, plus exile 3 other cards from your graveyard. At the beginning of the end step, you sacrifice Underworld Breach. We already talked about how good escape is in a Quintorius deck, because whenever you cast a spell with escape, you essentially make 2 spirit tokens with Quintorius, so giving everything in your graveyard escape is great. I would definitely include Underworld Breach in any Quintorius deck. I've simply excluded it from this one just to fit the budget. And as long as we're reiterating how awesome escape is for Quintorius, we need to think about Ox of Agonis. This is another one with escape. Ox of Agonis is a 4/2 creature that costs 5. When it enters the battlefield, you discard your hand, then draw 3 cards. You can escape it from the graveyard for red and exiling 8 other cards from your graveyard. Now this is a really great card draw option. Exiling 8 cards from your graveyard to escape it is actually a lot, but if you're empty-handed, it's probably worth it. And again, you'll make 2 spirits when you do this. Now we are using a few anthems that buff our team, but they're fairly weak. We're using them more for their synergy than more so than their raw power. But if you wanted a more powerful anthem, look no further than Balefire Liege. This 5-mana Spirit Horror gives all of your red creatures +1 and all of your white creatures +1/+1. That means Quintorius and all of his spirits get +2/+2 because they're both red and white. Balefire Liege also lets you bolt a player when you cast a red spell or gain 3 life when you cast a white spell. And it's a spirit, so Quintorius gives it +1 power, but again, that hardly matters. Now there's several other cards I considered that fit well, but they just didn't quite make the cut for my deck. But I think these are still very reasonable cards that you could include if you like them. First I want to mention Fuming Effigy and Stonebound Mentor. These are 2 new ones from Strixhaven that pretty obviously fit with what this deck is doing. Fuming Effigy is a 4/3 spirit that costs 3 and a red, and it says whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, Fuming Effigy deals 1 damage to each opponent. And Stonebound Mentor is a 3/3 spirit, it costs 1 red-white, and it has whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, scry 1. I didn't include these in my deck just because they weren't impactful enough. They definitely reward you for doing what you want to do anyways, but the reward is kind of underwhelming. And I really think this deck needs to focus more on enablers than payoffs. Speaking of payoffs, you might consider Devouring Rage. This is a 5-mana instant that lets you sacrifice any number of spirits as an additional cost to cast it, and it gives target creature +3/+0 until end of turn, and an additional +3/+0 until end of turn for each spirit you sacrificed to cast this spell. So if you've got maybe 8 spirits and you attack with all of them, if any one of them is left unblocked, you can sacrifice all the others to give that unblocked one +28 power, at least when Quintorius is on the battlefield, making all of your spirits have 4 power. That's a lot, but when you don't have a bunch of spirits, this does nothing. I just found it to be too situational. Now let's talk about Soul Blast. This is an instant that costs 3 red, red, red. As an additional cost to cast Soul Blast, you sacrifice all creatures you control, and Soul Blast deals damage to any target equal to the total power of the sacrificed creatures. So this is a lot easier to use than Devouring Rage. You don't need to worry about getting in for combat damage, and because each of your tokens has 4 power with Quintorius, it's not hard for you to knock out one opponent with Soul Blast alone. It is pretty risky though. If this gets countered or the damage gets prevented somehow, well, you've still sacrificed your entire board. Still, this will give you a lot of additional reach, and if it fits your playstyle, I definitely think it's worth an include here. Now, Angelic Destiny is a fun one that I really wanted to include. This is another one of those self-recurring auras. It costs 2 white white, and it gives the enchanted creature +4/+4 flying and first strike. And when the enchanted creature dies, you return Angelic Destiny to its owner's hand. Honestly, I'd probably put this one in the deck if I was okay with pushing the budget up a little bit, but I really wanted to keep it the whole deck around $75 or less. I mean, Angelic Destiny isn't that expensive, but it's maybe $3 or so. But I think this would be a good swap for Brilliant Halo if you wanted to. Now, Slate of Ancestry is another card draw option available to us. This is a simple 4-mana artifact. We can pay 4 and tap it and discard our hand, and we draw cards equal to the number of creatures we control. Again, we're using discard effects to fill our graveyard so that things can then leave our graveyard and make tokens with Quintorius. The Slate of Ancestry is another one that I've left out mainly just because, well, a deck can only have 100 cards, and it didn't quite make the cut. But again, this is a good card for this deck, so if you like it, fit it in. So that's my take on Quintorius, Field Historian. Again, this is a really unique commander. You'll really get to stretch to play in a way that's offbeat for Boros and include a lot of cards that you wouldn't typically play with. It's a lot of fun, but again, you do need to be careful to protect your commander. Well, with this deck build, I've tried to include a lot of value generation when things leave the graveyard, so at least we can still function a bit when Quintorius isn't on the battlefield. But if we want to make those spirit tokens, and we definitely do, then we'll absolutely need to keep Quintorius on the field. So let me know if you have any thoughts or alternative strategies for Quintorius, but that's all I've got for today. Check in again in the coming days and weeks as I'll be covering a few more unconventional deck techs for some of the commanders from Strixhaven and Commander 2021. But that is it for now. Thank you for watching.